Hello guys, in this video I'd like to talk about some major points from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, Chapters 6 and 7. In Chapter 6, the first thing I want to make sure you remember from Chapter 6 is Aristotle's distinction between the absolute mean and the relative mean. Now the absolute mean is like the arithmetical average, and it can be found by a formula. In fact, we know the formula for arithmetical average. We add up the numbers, divide by the number of numbers, and we have the average. The difficulty with this is that it's formulaic. This should let us know immediately that this is not going to be the kind of mean that Aristotle will associate with virtue. He just got done telling us previously in Book 1 that there is no standard that is formulaic or kind of recipe standard, an absolute impersonal standard in ethics. Instead, ethics is going to be an inexact science, the science of the circumstances of life, which are so various that we can't get the same level of precision that we would expect in mathematics. The relative mean is what ethics is, and this is the mean relative to the particular circumstances and needs in which the choice is being made. So it's not possible to give an exact formula for it without knowing what the circumstances are. We have to, in some important way, wing it. We have to make our best judgment call once we discover all the circumstances and variables around. So there is no impersonal, kind of off-the-shelf formula to apply for the life of virtue. And this fits with what Aristotle has told us before, his previous statements, that ethics is not subject to mathematical precision. It being a science of life, it requires judgment and prudence and practical wisdom that's generated from an accumulated life of experience and good choosing. So for Aristotle, the mean that is virtue is the mean relative to us and relative to our circumstances. I want to make two more points about that before moving on. First, this is not totally arbitrary. It can be different for different circumstances, but there is a right answer. Let's say that it is relative but not relativist, because for each situation there exists a true right answer, or a range of answers that are the right ones for that particular case, and answers outside that range are simply the wrong answers, objectively wrong. We might compare this to a doctor giving a diagnosis and a prescription to a patient. There are judgment calls to make given a certain set of symptoms and presentation, but the doctor is not able to just prescribe anything. There's a certain range of correct diagnoses and correct prescriptions that we would tolerate from a doctor. Now, a good doctor is the one who knows which circumstances to weigh heavily and which ones to ignore. He knows which symptoms are indicative of which diseases and which ones might indicate a complication that requires immediate intervention. He is, to use Aristotle's term, practically wise about human health. And as a result, he hits the target most of the time. That's what makes him a good doctor. His accumulated experience allows him, when he comes to wing it and to apply his knowledge and judgment under the particular circumstances which haven't arisen before, he's able to make the right judgment call most of the time. Okay, it's not a matter of taking a formula and applying it and adding up and dividing correctly. It's a matter of knowing what these particular circumstances are likely to require. That's the kind of good, that's the kind of mean that virtue is, the relative mean. The second point I want to make about this relative mean is it shows the need for prudence and good judgment in moral decision-making, not for rigid rules and formulas. There's a place for rules in the ethical life, but not the same way that we have a rule like force equals mass times acceleration in mathematics or in physics. Aristotle tells us that virtue is determined by reason, but it is specifically the reason of a practically wise person, like the good doctor in the example I just gave. So we should note how we depend on role models, people who are already brought up to be well-functioning morally in order to learn. If I don't have any people like that in my life, if I don't have any people who are already good judges of ethical action or virtue or prudence, it's going to be very difficult for me to develop that on my own without their guidance and their example to imitate. Back again to the importance of being well brought up and having the right kind of role models from your earliest youth. Last point that Aristotle makes in Chapter 6 that I want to call your attention to is that some actions are intrinsically depraved. They are incompatible with the human good and must always be avoided. There's no way to commit murder at the right place at the right time with the right person to the right extent. And another part of prudence, of good judgment and practical wisdom, is knowing what those actions are that must be avoided by all people, and not falling into the trap of trying to give an excuse that, well, I'm lying to my wife to the appropriate degree under the right circumstances, or whatever it is that is off limits to human beings. So that's something else to be aware of in the moral life. We learn what these immoral actions are, intrinsically immoral actions are, by experience, by becoming practically wise, and I think by listening to the practical wisdom, the accumulated practical wisdom of people who are already themselves morally good. And another word for that, I think, is tradition, in the right sort of sense. This is my Aristotelian appeal for the authority of tradition. If tradition is not just a matter of superstition or a sort of exaggerated reverence for the idealized past, it could be the record of accumulated good judgment of morally good people. It's not absolutely infallible. It might be overruled by us, especially if we think we've become more practically wise than the tradition, but it deserves a certain benefit of the doubt. If this is what good people have done up to now, it's probably what I should at least begin by doing or considering doing. I would need some strong reasons to override that presumption. I think that's one way of following out some of the social consequences of Aristotle's theory about ethics. Next, let's look at Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, Aristotle gives us a catalog of virtues with specific examples of means, the relative means, and the extremes on either side of them. Let's just take a look at a couple. In the crisp translation here, we're on page 32, towards the beginning of Chapter 7 of Book 2 of the Ethics. He tells us, in fear and confidence, courage is the mean. Courage is easy to understand. A person who has the right amount of fear in the face of danger and shows the right amount of confidence, that person is courageous. He will make the right judgment call most of the time. He says the person who is excessive in fearlessness has no name, and the one who exceeds in confidence is rash. He's rash or reckless. This is the person who doesn't hold back enough from facing danger. He charges ahead into danger when the wise thing to do would have been to hold back and to avoid the danger. So we'd say that person, he was too confident in his abilities, too confident, didn't show enough fear or enough withholding of action, reluctance to act. People deficient with regard to, he who exceeds in being afraid and is deficient in confidence, that person's a coward. That's easy to understand. We can think of people who are not bold enough, not confident enough, and so they don't take risks which they ought to take. And we can think of people who are far too confident, who charge ahead into danger, maybe to their ultimate sorrow. We say that those people are excessive about the very thing that the coward is deficient about. So there's the virtue of courage with the vices of recklessness on the excess side and the deficiency of cowardice on the other side. Let's take a look at the next one. With respect to pleasures and pains, not all of them, less so with pains, the mean is temperance, or moderation. The excess, intemperance. Okay, so what do we have here? We have another mean between extremes. The mean is temperance. This is regarding pleasure and pain. We might say this is regarding the level of enjoyment we take in pleasure, or the centrality we give to pleasure in our lives overall. A person who does that properly, who integrates, the enjoyment of pleasure correctly into their life, we say that person is temperate. Is a temperate or moderate person. The person who goes too far, the person who takes too much enjoyment in pleasure, who seeks pleasure too much, or who makes pleasure too central to his overall life, the person who's willing to sacrifice other goods or relationships for the sake of getting just a little bit more pleasure, we'd say, well, he's being unwise. He's not hitting the mean. He's missing the target pretty badly off to one side. He's being intemperate. He's going too far, too excessive, too much indulgence in pleasure. And as a result, he's not flourishing the way that he ought to. Okay? That's part of Aristotle's diagnosis. He says, people deficient with regard to pleasure are not very common. Right? Nature seems to have wired us pretty hard in the direction of overdoing it with regard to pleasure. But there are some people, perhaps, who don't enjoy pleasure enough, don't give it enough of a place in their life. And for those rare people, they don't have a name in Aristotle's Greek, but we might call them insensible. Okay, so they're just sort of dead. Right? They're made of stone. Right? They're not willing to dance and enjoy life with other people. That's unlikely to be most of us. Most of us, and in our time, maybe even more so than in Aristotle's time, are likely to go to the excess of pleasure. And so we ought to restrain ourselves. For our moral geography, so to speak, is going to involve trying to avoid intemperance by being a little bit more moderate and more restrained in our enjoyment of pleasure and our assignment of it to a place in our overall life. Now, let's do one more. He says, in the giving and taking of money, the mean is generosity, while the excess of these are deficiency and wastefulness. The excess and deficiency are wastefulness and stinginess. Okay, we can think of this as well. It's possible for a person to be generous to the right degree, with the right people at the right time, to the right extent. Very good. That's virtuous. That's hitting the bullseye. It's possible to miss the mean of generosity by being too stingy. This is like Ebenezer Scrooge. This is like if you show up at my house at mealtime unexpectedly and I just give you cheese and crackers because I'm saving the steak in the refrigerator for myself for tomorrow. I don't want to share that with you. I would say, somebody would say to me, you're being deficient in generosity. You ought to be, a good person ought to be generous, more generous than you're being right now in terms of sharing goods, in terms of giving and taking. It's also possible to be excessive in generosity, to miss the mark to the other side, to give away too much. So if I give away the rent money, or I give away the money I needed to save to repair my car, why? Because I wanted the good feeling of helping somebody out. My wife might say to me with some justice, you're doing generosity wrong, right? You're being generous, yes, and that's good, but only up to a certain point. You actually gave away something that you should have kept. And to that extent, you're being wasteful. She might say generosity is bad when you do it that way. And I might say, gosh, I didn't realize that. Yeah, it looks like my character is deficient in this way. I made the wrong judgment call there. I'm not like the good doctor who makes the right judgment call. I'm like the bad doctor, as it were, with my own life in terms of giving away property, giving away goods, giving away money. I gave away too much under the wrong circumstances to the wrong person at the wrong time, given the mean relative to me, my need to get my car repaired. So that's a walk through at least 3 different means and examples of the vices on either side of them from the beginning of chapter 7 of Aristotle's, book 2 of Aristotle's Ethics. I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.